But let's head on out to Hallis Hall, where Courtney Cronin not only took in Ryan Poles, but also there was another media scrum with the chairman of the board, George McCaskey, as well as Kevin Warren. She joins us here on ESPN Chicago. Courtney, another one of these State of the Unions for the Chicago Bears, and it's not pretty once again. Before we get into everything with Ryan Poles, since we weren't able to hear what took place with George McCaskey and Kevin Warren, can you kind of fill us in on some of the highlights there that those two had to say?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I'll start with George McCaskey because he was the last person who talked. And there were a couple different things there, like, putting the onus on himself for the Bears' failures this season and in previous seasons. It all falls on him. He's the head of the organization. That is something that he has to shoulder. And he says he does, but it was interesting when he was first question he was asked about was what happened in the Seattle game and how there were sell the team chants. He clearly heard them. He addressed it briefly, but then kind of deflected to a degree, which I was a little surprised about when he was talking about how the week before there were so many Lions fans that it threatened the, integrity of the stadium when your home team's on offense, that the Bears were almost going to have to use the silent count, which they didn't, but, in the address that they didn't. But I thought it was an interesting way to kind of flip things back on people who were selling their tickets because they didn't want to watch a team who at that point had 4 wins go through another game where they got their brains beaten by 17 points. So I thought that was a very interesting way to handle that in a rather diplomatic way, at least, of just kind of dishing it back out, what was being dished to ownership, which he said he understood the chants, but kind of an intriguing thing to say when the state of the team is what it is. But, beyond that, what we learned from George McCaskey and Kevin Warren continues to point to what has been said publicly about this search, that, when I asked Kevin Warren about what's going to happen if you do get a head coach candidate who comes in and wants a new general manager, what do you say to that person? And he said in a hypothetical manner, like, we have our structure, like he's confident that the structure that they have in place right now will leads them to a head coach. So it wasn't an outward no, but it wasn't an outward yes, that's fine. If somebody wants to come in, they can replace a general manager if they have a compelling argument. Like kind of like what you heard yesterday from Shad Khan, the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars. You weren't hearing that from the Bears by any stretch. And I'll say one more thing. It's very clear what the reporting structure is going to be here. George McCaskey mentioned everything's vertical, that it starts at the top, that the head coach reports to the general manager, who reports to the team president, who reports to the chairman and owner in George McCaskey, and that's not going to change. That's their process. Doesn't sound like they're going to be willing to have much wiggle room for people who are coming out from outside the building, wanting to change things maybe in order to take on this job, which we know the Bears have to sell themselves to some of these candidates who are wondering, is this going to be the right fit for me? Am I going to be out of a job in 3 years because there's things organizationally that aren't handled well that put me in a bad situation? So, that's what they're saying publicly. Now, if things change in the process, if there are head coach candidates who come in and aren't confident to link their timeline up with a general manager who is headed towards the end of his contract, maybe that leads them to give Ryan Poles a contract extension. But McCaskey said, he doesn't think that that's a deal breaker by any stretch, or should be a deal breaker, which kind of might highlight some of the thinking that the organizational structure is going into these interviews with.
What was your read on the contract talk? Because I feel like you'd have an easier time getting answers out of the Kremlin than getting answers out of anybody regarding Ryan Poles' contract. Nobody would say, yes, he's been extended. Nobody would say, no, he hasn't. Just, it won't be a factor in head coach interviews. What's your read on that?
If it was done, it's a very easy yes. Ryan has been extended. Put it to bed. This tells me that it hasn't happened. Doesn't mean it won't, but it tells me that it hasn't happened, probably for a number of reasons, because they probably are curious to see if that would deter any of the candidates that they put permission into talk with, those on NFL teams and those that they don't have to do that with in the college ranks. As we know, with David Shaw popping up as a candidate, the Stanford coach, Mike Vrabel, they don't have to put permission in with. They're set to meet with him tomorrow, reportedly. So I think that that's interesting because it does feel like maybe there's a feeling out process too if they don't get the extensive pool that they want, or, those results aren't yielding what they want, then maybe, you just don't want to, I guess, put cart before the horse there. But, George McCaskey, again, Shea, he said that he did not think it would deter any candidates. He's never seen that happen in the past. But as we know, just from living in reality, there are head coaches who want to be on the same timeline as general managers. Kevin Warren came from a place that purposefully synced up its head coach and general manager so they were on the same timeline. It last happened when he was, the outgoing, or actually might have been after him, like when Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman had that happen in 2020. They synced him up before the season, and it was a smart move going into a somewhat questionable year, and I think that would probably be something that they would be wise to do here. So you don't limit your candidates, but you also don't bring somebody in who's going to do something completely opposite of the GM if hired.
Follow up on that, because George mentioned and you mentioned the verticality of the organization, head coach to GM to president to chairman. Do you feel like that could be a deal breaker on hiring somebody like a Mike Vrabel who might want a little more personnel control, or like a Ben Johnson who the reporting is he wants a timeline with his GM?
I'm sure it could. If somebody has other options and the restructure somewhere else is more akin to what they want, they'll probably choose that. I understand why the Bears don't want to put it out there of like, well, yeah, like we're willing to, acquiesce to whatever these candidates want. Like at the end of the day, it's still the Bears making the hire. Like they're bringing somebody on. You can't hire yourself if you're one of these head coaching candidates. So I get it's kind of like not a power struggle, but it is something within the power structure of how they're trying to get land on a head coach, of how they would want to do that without just, you don't want to show all your cards right now. And I can understand that.
Courtney Cronin with us here on ESPN Chicago. Tyler Rocky, Shea Norling in for Greeny today. Getting more into like the verticality structure within the organization. I mean, they have 2 playoff appearances in the last 14 years. They have never found the quarterback. Why not switch things up here? Is there why the hesitancy to shuffle the deck a little bit and maybe try something else that might work?
In terms of what exactly?
In terms of like how the structure of the organization is set up. So in the case of if you brought in a Mike Vrabel and he would report to the owner.
I think the way they're looking at it, because we know that places that are change averse, places that have systemic issues that are so deeply rooted, they're hard to undo, is that they believe, at least they've got a loophole for that, where Kevin Warren and Ryan Poles have never led a head coaching search together. I know what was said back in 2022. I picked him. We all know how that went down with George McCaskey, Ted Phillips, everybody else in those meetings, and the pairing, I'm going to use that word again, between Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus. I think the way that George looks at this is that he wants to trust that Poles and Kevin Warren can lead this coaching search in a place where they don't have to blow up their entire structure. They want to keep their systems in place. Like they kept mentioning, the standard has to be where the standard is. And if somebody deviates below the line of the standard, well, that's not a personal thing. It's just that you can't be here. You can't be part of that. And I think the same thing goes for their structure. They want to keep their structure in place. And if somebody can't fall in line with it or find a way to work with it, then that person doesn't need to be here. Might it not yield might they need some pretty radical change? I think that's a fair thing to ask for, Tyler. I really do. But I just think that the way they're looking at this is that they don't want to blow up everything when making, the biggest decision you can make, one of them in an organization, and trust that, why else have these people here if you don't trust them to make the right decision with the structure the way that it is?
Did you feel like Ryan Poles tipped his hand about roster construction at all in his opening statement? He rattled off a list of players that he was proud of, or I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he's going through like guys who developed and performed, and he mentioned Cole Kmet, he mentioned TJ Edwards. I don't think I heard Jermaine Edmonds' name. Is he tipping his hand a bit that Jermaine Edmonds isn't going to be back?
He didn't mention him. I think the ones that, those are kind of like the cornerstone pieces that you expect. He gave Jalen Johnson the shout out for the Pro Bowl, all of those notable things that you do when there's players you're proud of. And I think if you would get polls on the topic of Tremaine Edmonds, kind of like what he talked about with Montez Sweat, really not being that multiplier that That's the word he used for him last year when he got the Pro Bowl and he came here and he got 6 sacks and led the team. There's a fall off in production there, and you're not going to praise a player who you brought in, was one of your priority free agents 2 years ago, if that player didn't live up to the contract and didn't live up to what you needed out of him from the defense. Now, I'm sure if you were to ask him again in a public setting, he of course would make sure to say someone's name like that so it doesn't look like he's purposefully leaving him out. But I do think that is, it's kind of obvious. It speaks to how forgettable his play was this year. Like, how many times you're like, wow, Tremaine Edmonds, flash play there. Like, I can count the London game, the play before halftime on, like, the tip and then the forced fumble and all of that. But there really weren't that many moments where you looked back at it and said that was the upgrade we were looking for when we let Roquan Smith walk or traded him the year before. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like that was one that was so forgettable that you forgot to mention him in the list of players that he's most proud of.
Courtney Cronin's our guest live from Hallis Hall. So one of the things Ryan Poles also alluded to in the coaching search is that at least in the early stages, Ian Cunningham not going to be a part of it because they're letting him focus on him getting his own GM job and doing some interviewing out there. How concerned should Bears fans be by that?
I don't think concerned at all. I don't, because, that's what, honestly, if Ian Cunningham gets a job after the way that this team performed this year, he's been a hot head coach, assistant general manager to general manager candidate to make that jump the last 2 years. He turned down jobs in Arizona. I believe the Titans one when Ryan Carthon was hired was a job that Ian was in play for too. Last year he interviewed for Washington, didn't get that job. So naturally their teams are probably going to come calling because most times you see the same candidates get interviewed for these things. So I think that Ryan's just trying to protect against that, where you don't want somebody 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Remember last year early on, Ian was interviewing, so he wasn't a part of the search to find the new offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator at the onset of that in January. So I'm not surprised by that at all. And I don't think, it is obviously he's Ryan Poles' right-hand person. He's somebody that has done a lot for this organization behind the scenes that you don't see because of how well connected he is. Specifically with some championship organizations, places like Philly. He's a big part of the trades that went there. He's a big part of, the trades with Pittsburgh. There's a lot there, but I do think that having him in the process when he's trying to focus on, going out and getting his own general manager job at one point, whether it happens now or somewhere else, that's kind of the play that you have to make if you're Ryan Poles, just to make sure that you're not spreading somebody that thin to where you're not really they're not really much of an asset in these meetings.
Like, I get that part of it, but we've also seen the clips of him holding back Ryan Poles from potentially trading up in the draft. And you mentioned he wasn't really a part of the looking for the offensive coordinator. Like, the offensive coordinator search was a abject failure from a season ago. Like, shouldn't the Bears, and I get, but in a perfect world where maybe he's not interviewing, wouldn't you want a guy like him in the room trying to help you make this hire?
Yeah, you'd want the people closest to Ryan Poles who have his best interest in mind and who can pull him back, like you mentioned with the clip that we saw in 1920 Football Drive, when he was trying to trade up potentially because he was afraid Roma Odunze wasn't going to be there. And Ian was like, "You sure about that? Like, you sure you want to do that?" And kind of took his hand off the trigger there. So I think that that's naturally something that you're going to wonder about. But at this point, Ryan's got to trust that the other people he has in there, Matt Feinstein, who's his salary cap guy, manages all of the finances that they can have for this roster. Jeff King. Interesting that he didn't say Trey Cozio is the director of player personnel here. He mentioned those two, Kevin Warren, George McCaskey, and then Liz Geist, who's, the head of HR for the Bears. And then there's people on the business side, senior leadership, EVPs as well, that will be part of some of the later interviews. I think you got to guard against having too many cooks because, there's enough voices in there with the 6 of them, including Ryan Poles, that you should probably have enough guidance to where if you really need a 7th, does that say something about the other people that you have in there that you don't trust what, they're saying to get through to you? I think that that's part of it as well.
2 questions quickly. One, going back to something you said earlier about Poles and Eberflus, you stressed the word pairing. Are you saying that Poles did not choose Eberflus?
We know how that went down. He got here, and then 2 days later, the head coach is hired. Like, this was a process that they went through where they interviewed a bunch of head coach candidates. They interviewed a bunch of general manager candidates. Ted Phillips was a part of the process that last time around because he was the team president. George McCaskey was part of the process that time around because that was, I believe, his 12th year in as chairman of the organization. From people I've spoken with, the process was different than what it's going to be this time around, where the general manager actually picks the head coach.
Okay, second question. Kevin Warren talked about, I think the quote was, we're going to get a world-class coach, whether that's Thomas Brown or someone outside the organization, we will get this right. Mm-hmm. Is it too much to read into the fact? Like, I don't think he needed to mention Thomas Brown there. Is it reading into it to say that?
I think it's a respect thing, and the fact that you have an internal candidate who was here for 5 weeks, the general manager just went on radio on our station and said that he's getting an interview. It's the right thing to do. How serious of a candidate Thomas Brown will be compared to some of the other names you're hearing, I think that you could probably deduce that there will be some other names that are probably more attractive to the organization, but they want to hear what he has to say. I mean, and think what you want about the results. He was here every day. Like, I would be curious when he said yesterday that the offense is going to look a lot different. If I'm in those meetings, sell me on it. Show me why it's going to be different. Tell me why the Sean McVay system that you didn't get to install here would work for someone like Caleb Williams and the rest of this offense. So I think it'll be a serious interview. He's certainly going to get it at some point, and like I would imagine this week they're going to start. We know that Mike Vrabel's coming tomorrow. There will be others, but I'm not surprised that he said it that way. And I'm very curious to see the double-digit numbers that this list ends up getting up to, because at some point you've got to be like, enough. We've got enough names. We've got to sift through all of this. You want to have the widest pool possible, but you also are a little bit up against it because there's other teams that are going to be trying to make a decision, and you don't want to be a step behind the process when another team's ready to go offer somebody who might be at the top of your list, and then having to circumvent it and the whole thing. I think it's something they're going to have to expedite, but not rush upon, if that makes sense.
Courtney, you asked the question in the Ryan Poles press conference about the trade. Would you be open to trading? And they didn't rule it out. A, do you believe that they could trade for someone? And B, is there someone that you have in mind that they feasibly could trade for?
I mean, you hear the stuff about Kevin O'Connell, and I know that, could that be a ploy to get him a contract extension because he was apparently not happy that he didn't get one after last season with Minnesota? Sure. I know what he said publicly, that he wants to be in Minnesota. He loves it there. He's obviously got a great team that's going to the playoffs. All those things are great. But if you're going to do this search and do it right, you evaluate all options. You don't rule that out, which is what they didn't do. They said that they're going to go any avenue they can to find their next head coach. And if that does lead you to a place where knowing what it takes, it's really not as expensive as you would think. I mean, think about what it costs for Sean Payton to go from the Saints to the Denver Broncos. We've seen it with John Gruden, from the Raiders to the Bucks. It's not like you're giving up the haul or whatever. Like, I feel like oftentimes we see more draft capital given up to move up in the draft order than we do see for a head coach coming in. And of course, a lot of that is financially, because coaches don't count against the salary cap. You got to pay them. This team is going to have to do things differently. And, people I've spoken with about the process, how are they going about it? Are we seeing George McCaskey picking up candidates at the airport at O'Hare? That's going to be different this time around. That's one thing that, when Matt Eberflus was fired all the way till now, I've checked in on that. They're going to try to make themselves look like a world-class organization because they really do have the capabilities of doing that. That means not flying people in on economy. That means, giving anybody who comes in the world-class treatment that you want to reflect well on this organization. And it may sound like a small thing, but it's not. I promise you it's not. And they don't view it as that here. And so when we talk about this search being different than the last time around, something as ancillary as the accommodations for how you're going to treat the candidates, to get them here, to get them, to and from your building, all of that does end up factoring in a big way to the type of candidates that you're probably going to be able to draw in for interviews.
Courtney, we all saw the Jay Glazer report. You just referenced Kevin O'Connell, potential trade candidate as a head coach. You know the Vikings as well as anyone. Give me a percent odds. It can't be higher than 1%, right? I laughed at it.
I think we knew what was happening when that was said during their pregame broadcast. The Vikings are a team, they don't do head coach searches that often. Kevin Warren knows that because he was there. Mike Zimmer was there for 8 seasons. The Wilfs do not have an appetite for having to go through this every couple of years. And even after, the seasons at the end when they were 7-9 and 8-8, missing the playoffs, they still stuck with Zimmer until a point where they saw they could make a clean break from Zimmer and Rick Spielman and move in a different direction. That being said, I don't think they want to go through this process again of having to find another head coach. So I put the odds pretty low, but it doesn't mean that a team like Chicago shouldn't check in on that to see what it would cost.
In the division, it would be pretty funny if something
that's
like that
also
happened.
The other radical part of it, to trade a coach in the NFC North. But, that's not the only name that's out there. Kyle Shanahan had been rumored for a long time, dating back to, the midway point of the season. Maybe things aren't great in San Francisco. And I know what John Lynch has said. I know what Kyle Shanahan has said. That's one that if you feel there is a coach that is so much better than anybody that you have in your current candidate pool, then you at least tap into it. Heck, we all follow Carl Williams on Twitter. We all saw the thing that he tweeted the other day about the John Gruden when he was traded, the Raiders and Bucks trade. Mm-hmm. Does that shed some light onto the way that he's thinking about this process? That might be, there might be somebody that has his eye. And I would imagine Kevin O'Connell, you can think about whatever you want. Maybe he says it to every quarterback because he went up to Anthony Richardson. He went up to Caleb Williams after the game, whispering things to them about how great they're going to be and all of that. He's done a lot with Sam Darnold in year one. He did a lot with Kirk to get him back on track in 2 seasons in Minnesota. I think that there are people who view proven success that's already happening with a head coach as an easier path to getting it with your own quarterback. And it might cost you a couple draft picks that they have extra draft capital. I'm not saying that the second round pick that they have from Carolina is that great, but you have to make those sacrifices if that is the route that you want to go and knowing what it's going to take to get somebody like that in your building. But if that person fits within the structure and doesn't want to blow up the structure that you want to cling to if you're the Bears, then maybe that's an avenue as they get further into the interview process. Remember, they have not started yet. They could have started last week. They didn't. It's something that I think is worth discussing and worth exploring if they really want to do this the right way.
Courtney, great stuff, and hopefully we're not having this conversation in 3 years again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you, guys.